At 2:17 a.m., deployed in the Kuwaiti desert, Jackson opened an email from his wife. She was divorcing him and had sold their house without telling him. No warning, no conversation, just a PDF of the sale, already finalized. His entire life dismantled in a few cold sentences. But what he uncovered next would tear the truth wide open. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Jackson stared at the screen, unblinking, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more humane, more explainable. But they didn't. They sat there like tombstones, flat, final, and merciless. The pale light of the laptop flickered against the cement walls of the outpost, making his shadow twitch behind him like it, too, was trying to pull away. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the distant thrum of a generator and the occasional hiss of desert wind sneaking through the cracks. He scrolled down, rereading every word, hoping to find something between the lines, a note of hesitation, regret, a trace of the woman who had once fallen asleep in his arms with her hand on his chest, like she was afraid he'd vanish in the night. But the message read like a transaction, like he was nothing more than an obligation she'd finally crossed off her list. No warmth, no explanation, just finality. The phrase, "the proceeds are already handled," scraped across his mind like broken glass. Jackson knew what it meant. She'd emptied the account. He had set up joint access before his second tour, never thinking he'd need to protect himself from her. He trusted her implicitly. She had held his mother's hand at the funeral, stood beside him when he was promoted to staff sergeant. She was supposed to be the constant, the anchor waiting on the shore while he weathered storm after storm. Now, the anchor had cut him loose. His breathing turned shallow. He tried to ground himself in the surroundings. Gray duffel, steel cot, the tattered photograph of him and Emily taped beside his bunk. He tore it down with a force that surprised even him, his fingers shaking as he crumpled it into his fist. He didn't feel angry yet. He felt naked, stripped of safety, of memory, of belonging. And somehow, even thousands of miles away from home, that absence felt like the most dangerous battlefield he'd ever stepped onto. There was no space to grieve here, no room for the kind of breakdown that should have come. He couldn't scream, couldn't even speak. So he sat there in his sweat-damp uniform, staring at the empty screen long after the email had been closed, willing himself not to fall apart in a place where falling apart wasn't allowed. And quietly, inside a man trained never to flinch, something began to fracture. The rage didn't come all at once. It bled in slowly, like oil spreading through water. At first, Jackson simply moved, one foot in front of the other. He checked weapons, gave orders, maintained patrol rotations like muscle memory. But under the surface, something corrosive began to eat away at him. It wasn't heartbreak. Heartbreak required a wound you could trace. This was different. It was obliteration, a clean wipe, like someone had reached into his life and pressed delete. When he finally managed to call her, it wasn't for closure. It was to hear her voice, to ask the one question that had haunted every sleepless hour since the email. Why? Emily answered after the second ring. No hesitation, no tremble, just that voice, unrecognizable, stripped of warmth. She sounded like someone speaking to a stranger about a business transaction. "I needed to move on," she said, just like that. No apology, no struggle, no tremor of conflict in her tone. "You're always gone, Jack. I don't know who you are anymore. The house was in both our names and I needed the money." The words hit harder than incoming fire. Jackson tried to process them, tried to make them make sense, but they didn't. She didn't know who he was anymore. as if years of sacrifice, the missed holidays, the lonely birthdays, the goodnight calls from war zones, meant nothing. She had stripped him of his home and dignity with clinical precision, and now here she was, explaining it like a line item on a budget report. Then he asked the question he almost didn't want answered. "Where's Max?" Her pause was short. Too short. "I gave him to a neighbor. He liked them better anyway." That broke something. Not because of the dog, though it mattered, but because of what it meant. Max was family. He was their bridge between deployments, their shared comfort. She hadn't just let him go. She had discarded him, like a keepsake from a part of her life she'd outgrown. Jackson felt his pulse surge, not just because of the betrayal, but because of her indifference. It wasn't just that she had made these choices. It was how easily she made them, how little he seemed to matter in the calculus. The hatred didn't burn hot. It chilled. It was a frozen kind of fury that set deep into his bones. He lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his barracks, fists clenched beneath the blanket. Sleep became irrelevant. Time irrelevant. He began memorizing every word she had said, like carving initials into stone. Not for revenge. Not yet. But because some part of him needed to remember exactly how it felt to be erased so cleanly. Anger didn't unmake Jackson. It reconstructed him. Piece by piece, like armor being riveted onto raw flesh. What began as hollow devastation had calcified into something sharper, something with direction. His pain had a name now. It had a strategy. And every minute Emily spent believing she'd gotten away with it added fuel to a fire she didn't know she'd lit. The Army JAG officer was polite but constrained. "Power of attorney means she didn't technically need your signature," he explained, voice dipped in legal detachment. "Unless you can prove fraud or misuse." Unless. That was all Jackson needed to hear. That slim window, so narrow it may as well have been a crack in a bunker wall, became his focus. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was a tactician. And betrayal? Betrayal was a battlefield. He contacted a civilian attorney in the States who specialized in military divorce and property disputes, paid the retainer with what little savings Emily hadn't touched. Then he started digging. Nights in the Kuwaiti heat, while his comrades played poker or Skyped their families, Jackson buried himself in research. He read real estate statutes under dim light, screens blurring from sand and exhaustion. He combed through his emails, export logs from their shared cloud drive, banking statements from the joint account. Nothing escaped scrutiny. Then came the gut punch that sharpened everything. Emily hadn't just left. She'd moved in with someone they both knew. One of his old college friends, Michael, a man Jackson had invited to their home more than once for beers and backyard barbecues. Less than 14 days after the sale, Michael's name appeared on a utilities transfer, and Emily's signature was right beside his. That did it. The betrayal wasn't just emotional or financial. It was calculated, orchestrated, and Jackson, once the loyal husband, now became the immovable force. When deployment ended, he stepped off the plane with little more than his duffel bag and rage refined into focus. His suit for court was borrowed, the knees just a little loose, but he stood taller than he ever had in uniform. For hours, he laid out every thread, every forged click, every cent siphoned from their account. Emily was there, smiling at first. But when the judge's expression shifted, when words like misrepresentation, re-examination, and asset freeze landed like bullets, her smile faltered. Jackson didn't gloat, he didn't flinch, because this wasn't revenge. It was the first moment since Kuwait that he felt visible again. Not erased, not discarded, seen, heard, and no longer powerless. The ruling was clear. written in dry legal phrasing but resonating with a weight Jackson hadn't known he needed. Malicious and deceitful. 2 words that validated what no one else had witnessed, how he had been gutted in silence, disassembled piece by piece while serving thousands of miles from home. The courtroom hadn't been a battlefield, but it felt like a war had been won. Emily's strategy had been methodical, but the law had spoken. Not only was she wrong, she had lied, and she would be held accountable. The financial restitution was thorough. Half of the home's proceeds were returned to him, plus damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and the misuse of power of attorney. But as the check was handed over, Jackson barely looked at the figure. The numbers didn't matter, not in the way people assumed. It wasn't about being made whole in the bank. It was about proof, undeniable, recorded proof, that he hadn't imagined the betrayal, that someone else saw it too. The moment that cut deepest, though, came far from any courtroom. He stood at the edge of a cracked front porch one overcast afternoon, heart pounding harder than it had in combat, waiting for a screen door to swing open. And when it did, there was Max, older, grayer around the muzzle, but still bounding forward like no time had passed. The neighbor, Mrs. Keller, said nothing. She didn't need to. Her hand on Jackson's shoulder said everything. Jackson sank to his knees in the gravel driveway and buried his face in the scruff of Max's neck. The dog whimpered, tail wagging in frantic disbelief, as if both of them had been underwater and had finally surfaced. Jackson hadn't cried in court. He hadn't cried after the ruling. But here, in the dirt, beside a dog who had once slept at his feet during long winters, the tears came freely. He never dragged Emily's name through the mud. No interviews, no vindictive posts. He let the judgment speak, and let silence say the rest. Vengeance wasn't what he craved. Peace was. With time, that peace became something more. He bought a small ranch house on the outskirts of town. Nothing flashy, just quiet, open sky, and soil that felt like it could hold something steady. He started volunteering with veterans groups, not to preach, but to listen. Stories like his weren't rare, but rarely told. He didn't just survive Emily's betrayal. He rebuilt the pieces of himself she thought she had erased, and became a man stronger than he had ever been. Not untouched, not unscarred, but whole.